Good afternoon, everyone. It is exciting to be back in the studio here at Lewis University. I'm Dave Livingston, president of Lewis, and I'm joined this afternoon, as usual, by Dr. Christopher Sint, our provost at Lewis. Just a couple quick comments at the beginning. We're really excited to be back in studio today, and I do want to acknowledge that we are at Lewis University's radio and TV studio. It's exciting to be here, and we have a great program in studio production, and two of our students are actually directing and running audio today for us. Reed Poland is directing the show today, and Matt Mohan doing audio, so I want to thank them. Grateful to, of course, John and John, who help us out regularly, but and are great faculty for us in terms of what they do to prepare students for a future in radio and TV. A couple quick things. You know, there's so much good news going on campus, every week, but a couple things that I wanted to note today. We are ranked 7th in the country in cross country this week, which is exciting news. You know, there's not a lot of athletics going on the Division II level, but cross country are running races, and to be ranked 7th in the country is really great. And I want to shout out to our cross country athletes. So excited for that. And the other thing is that our Jet Fuel Review magazine ended up in the top 3. And we will hear the final winner on that, but heard word this week that we're in the top 3 in the country in terms of literary magazines being put out at the collegiate level. So excited about that. So Chris, I know there's a few announcements. We don't have many announcements. Then we have a great topic to talk about today. Really excited about our guest, but I know you have a couple announcements, and then maybe we can turn to our guest.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. And we do just have maybe a couple things to talk about before bringing on our guest. The first is we've received several questions on our Ask Us email address. And again, if you have questions during the show, please send those in now. And several have to do with the topic for the day, which is elections and voter turnout. And so we'll save those for when we're with Steve Nawara, our guest. One had to do with in relationship to the spring semester. So we talked about the spring semester plan, I think just last week. And one of the questions that came through was how to go about requesting having online instruction for the spring. And my answer to that, or our answer to that, is simply that when the schedule comes out, the modality or the way that the course is going to be taught, whether it's online or hybrid or in person, will be indicated on the schedule. And so the first thing to do would be to just choose online courses, and anybody can do that, of course. And if for some reason the schedule that you need working with your advisor doesn't work for the spring semester, then you can contact through your advisor to get some help from our people in the LRC, who will probably try to find a way to make the schedule work if you need to be online. But there is no special form or anything like that to fill out for online instruction. It should be able to be done. And I think as we're looking at the schedule, about 35% or so of our classes will be online in the spring, so it should not be a difficulty for most students. But we know some classes will not be online, and for some majors and so on. So we'll just try to start working on that with you now and continue to work on it until we figure out a plan. Really, the only other topic I wanted to bring up today is about the time in the fall semester between Thanksgiving and Christmas vacation. So really, as we get closer to it, and we are hearing a lot of questions from members of our community about what that time is going to be like. And I think it's slowly becoming clear that we've really never had a situation like this, where our semester is continuing, the engagement in the classes is online, but fully present. Our finals are the same as they always are. The weeks of instruction, as the semester concludes, are the same, except for that the courses are online. And I know that instructors are working with their classes and have plans for those things. But I think it's confusing because usually when we're not together in person, it's a it's a time, it's the week of Christmas, it's the week of spring break. We really do shut down quite a bit as a campus, and it's really not going to be like that on this campus between Thanksgiving and December. All of our support offices will be open they'll be open virtually. They'll also be open for appointments in most cases. So if you live in the area and would rather drive to campus and have a meeting with a financial aid advisor or someone from the registrar's office, they will be there to make those appointments with. The library will be open in similar ways. You'll be able to reserve study space as well, inside the library or in any of the study space rooms that we've set up. And student activities even will be mostly online as they are now, but there'll also be some in-person possibilities for people who are in the region and just want to connect. Not required, but available for our student population during that time period between Thanksgiving and December. And then finally, the housing is available during that time as well. Of course, all of our planning is contingent on the continued health and safety of the community. But as things move closer to that time, it's the ability to do housing on campus is simply a matter of filling out a form. And I'm sending out an email to the community as usual this afternoon, and the link to that form will be in that email. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I know this is more of a
and maybe
talking thing than a
right. And
announcement.
I want to get to our guest, but I do want to just address very briefly, and this will be really quick. There was another question that came in on Ask Us at lewis.edu that we really want, again, we want people to use that. So if there's questions out there right now, as we get into our guest or before. But we did have a question because there was an announcement in the HR update recently that talked about just being aware that there are some people that are with this huge amount of unemployment requests to the government. There are people that are kind of scamming people and taking advantage of other people's basically Social Security and applying on behalf of somebody else that they're unemployed. And the volume, because the volume's so high, some of that is getting through on the state or federal level. Without going into details, and certainly people can reach out to HR, but the question was, how many cases of that have we had at Lewis? Without specific numbers, we're about the same as other institutions. It's not a huge problem, but there have been some desires, just like with, and I guess I'll use this as a time to say, with all sorts of, private information and things that we all have to be cautious of, to our employees, even to our students, I can promise you that I'm never going to send you an email asking for a gift card. So sometimes people use my email and they just make up an ending to it, and it's not lewisu.edu, but they use my name or use the provost's name because they just go on our website and do that. And these same kind of scams exist, and especially when people are getting tons of email or the government's getting tons of applications for unemployment, they tend to use those as a way of manipulating the system. So I guess what I would say mostly is, be aware, just like we've talked about, and I'll use this little opportunity to say about wearing face coverings, washing your hands, be vigilant. Be vigilant about somebody using your or somebody else's email to request something from you, and certainly be vigilant when it comes to the health and safety of the Lewis community. And with that, I'd like to turn over to you, Dr. Sint, to introduce our guest and our topic for the day. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Great. So we're very pleased to introduce Dr. Stephen Nawara to the program today. Steve has a PhD from The Ohio State University, and his research interests include political behavior, public opinion, political parties. He's the moderator for the Lewis University's Alpha Theta Gamma chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Political Science Honor Society. He's taught classes in a whole range of things in political science: American government, political parties, interest groups, media, Congress, research methods, campaigns and elections, foreign policy, and political scandals. So we're particularly interested in the topic of campaigns and elections today. Of course, the election is, I think, 19 days from now, 19, 20 days. So welcome, Steve.
Hi.
Great to be with you. And we're really excited about this, about talking a little bit about voting, especially, and voter turnout in relationship to the oncoming election. So
Thank you for having me.
I feel like a pretty informed person and citizen, and I still have to admit I sometimes get a little confused about voting and overwhelmed by the differences from place to place and election to election. So I guess my first question, I hope other people might relate with my experience a little bit, especially our students. So could you just, in a nutshell, explain what are the steps of voting, how voting works, and then especially on a college campus for students who are coming to campus from another city or town, how does that process translate to the college experience?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you again for having me. In terms of how voting works, this is a question I get a lot from students, particularly those that haven't even had the chance to vote before, because you have to be 18 years old to participate in American elections. Most college students never had the opportunity to vote before if they're traditional undergraduates. So in the United States, we have a system by which you typically have to register to vote in order to vote before participating. That voter registration is tied to your address and your residence because so many of the elections that we participate in have individual districts. Aside from the President of the United States, which represents all Americans, everything else that we vote on is done at a more local level, either a statewide election or a congressional district, or even down to very tiny, city council districts or school board districts. So where you are will depend on what offices you are voting for in any given race. So for that reason, your address determines your what ballot you get and what precinct you vote at. So you have to register. And once you are registered, you would go down to your polling place. Typically, you just show up, and a really nice volunteer or poll worker, maybe not volunteer, they do get paid a little bit of money. They will ask you your name, and they will look you up in the book. And assuming that everything matches, you will sign for your ballot. They will cross-check the signature and hand you your ballot, where you'd go and fill it out in the privacy of the voting booth and put it through the machine reader when you're done. And it's easy as that. It's not a super complicated process. It can be a little bit intimidating if you've never done it before, just because you don't know what to expect. But if you've asked, anybody else who's voted, it's usually a positive experience. The second part of your question was about college students in particular. And the reason why I went into all that detail about your residency affecting where you vote, that has an interesting wrinkle for college students, because college students can have more than one residency. Chances are most college students have a primary residence with their parents or someone else that they live with. But if you live on campus or nearby off campus, you may have a temporary place of residence. And the law says that you can choose to register to vote at either your permanent home address or your temporary address, assuming you've lived there for at least 30 days. So if you live on campus, for instance, you've presumably have been there since the start of the semester, you will have lived at Lewis University for more than 30 days. So you have the choice to register to vote either at home with your home address or with your Lewis University campus address. And the only difference it really makes is that which choice you pick will determine where you're going to vote and what offices you're going to vote on. If you choose your home address on election day, you're going to have to go to your home address's polling place and cast a ballot or vote early by mail or in person. If you choose your campus address at Lewis University, on election day, your polling place will be Romeoville High School, which is about a mile north of campus on Route 53 off of Taylor Road. And so it's really a choice that the the individual registrant gets to make as to where they want to cast their ballot.
So, Steve, could I just ask a follow-up question on that? Because I find that, I think for those of us that have voted for 30 years in every election or something like that, or whatever, it's been a while for me. The issue about the location, some of these down ballot things that you talk about, they could be school board, members, or issues about a referendum that might be just on a local thing, a taxation issue. I mean, for our students, I guess maybe I'm asking whether you, as you talk to students when they ask you this question, well, where should I vote, Dr. Nawara? Should I vote here in Romeoville, or should I vote in my home? Do you usually talk to them about, well, you might know somebody from your church, or somebody that's running for school board because they're your mom's friend, and so maybe you'd want to vote at home if you care about that. Or if those low-level issues don't matter to you, it might be easier for you to go up 53 north a few blocks and vote there. I mean, how do you talk to them about how to make that decision? Which address?
Yeah, I think at the basic level, you should register to vote where it'll be easiest to do so. If you have a home address that is an hour away from Romeoville, and you're not planning on voting early or by mail, you might not want to spend an hour each way on a Tuesday driving to vote and returning to campus. That said, if there is an attachment that you have to your home residence that is greater than your attachment to the local politics of Romeoville, Illinois, absolutely go vote where you think you want to have that greater impact. I'm thinking back when I was a college student, I voted I think in every election, and I voted at home. Even though I went to school at Ball State in Indiana, I voted early at the courthouse in Illinois because I knew I wanted to vote on, my local school district's referendum. I wanted to vote for my local mayor. I wasn't as attached to Muncie, Indiana, as I was Hickory Hills, Illinois. And I want to make it clear to the students or anybody else listening that at least in Illinois, it's quite easy to vote absentee. Voting by mail and voting early in person is widely available and is not that many hurdles to jump over. So if you are registered or want to register at your home address and vote in your local elections at home, the way you can do that is that when you register, you can then at any point over the next couple of weeks vote at an early in-person voting location in your community. Usually at county clerk's offices, a lot of times city halls, sometimes libraries will have permanent polling locations for early voting. Or if you're not going to be traveling home, you can request a mail-in ballot through your county clerk's office. So for example, in Will County, you go to thewillcountyclerk.com and request a mail-in ballot anytime before October 29th. They will mail you a ballot and send it back to your dorm or wherever you're living right now. And as long as that ballot is postmarked by Election Day and arrives within, I think, 2 weeks after the election, you will have your vote counted just like everybody else. That October 29th deadline, is the hard deadline, I guess would be the way to say it. I always recommend my students who are planning on voting by mail to fill out that application to vote by mail early. The earlier, the better, because the sooner they get the application, the sooner they'll mail your ballot. And that way, if there is some sort of delay with the Postal Service, your vote will still get there in plenty of time.
Steve, just to follow up on one thing about that.
The other thing is, sorry.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. So if a student is not, if their permanent address or their home address is not in Illinois, they would still take the same advice and go to the county in their home state. But there might be slightly different rules about how to do absentee voting.
This is the joys of our federalist system, that we have a national government, but individual states have a lot of power and authority in certain areas. And one of those areas in which states have a ton of authority is elections. that each state pretty much runs their own election. And even within states, every county pretty much has their own priorities and systems and applications too. So once you get beyond the rules for Illinois, it's kind of the Wild West. Some states make it very easy to vote by mail. Other states are incredibly restrictive. I think it's the state of Missouri passed a law in the past year that said that if you're going to vote by mail, you have to have your ballot notarized by a notary. Which is a pretty large hurdle for somebody to go through in order to vote absentee, in my opinion. But Illinois, at least, it's fairly simple.
So we did have a question come in.
Okay.
So we have a staff member, Steve, who asks, can I vote if my last name, which is their married name, on my driver's license does not match my voter registration, which was my maiden name? So,
yes.
So they have a registration card with a maiden name, and now they have a married name currently. Can they still vote?
Yeah, what I would recommend that person do is to update their voter registration online now. If they are not able to do so before the deadline, which is on Sunday. But we're still in open registration in Illinois. You can go online right now until Sunday and vote, register to vote. And that includes things like changing your name, changing your address, and updating that kind of information. But let's say, hypothetically, this person's busy and forgets. Even after that, on Election Day, you can still show up to your polling place as an unregistered voter or as a voter who needs to change your address. And if you can show proper identification, or if your driver's license number is going to match the number that they have recorded down for you, you should still be able to vote. If you ever do encounter a problem like that, you can still ask for what's known as provisional ballot, and you would be allowed to fill out a ballot just like any other voter, except they put it off to a separate pile. I think it's even a different color. And it's not counted right away. It wouldn't be counted until after the election. And basically, it gives you a window of, I think, 10 or 14 days to straighten out any issues that you had. And then at that point, your vote would be added to the rest of the pile and counted.
And Steve, this is
I
essentially...
don't know if that was more detail than you needed, but...
No, it's super helpful.
It's great. I think people are really going to benefit from this.
Yeah, and so this is essentially the kind of thing that happens when you were describing, you walk into the polling place and they check your name on the ledger or so on. That's when that conversation happens, is when, they're checking to see if you're a registered voter. And
the only thing that would be a problem, I suppose, would be if you were voting by mail for the first time and you had that situation. But even then, I don't think it would necessarily be an issue, because in Illinois, your identity is established when you register to vote, and your identity is confirmed by your signature at the polling place. So technically, you don't even need to bring an identification to vote in Illinois. I always recommend people bring them just in case, so you can avoid those kind of provisional ballot issues that I just mentioned. But I personally have never been asked or needed to show any type of identification when I vote.
Steve, on that front, it does seem like, again, depending on the poll worker, that if I did change my name that this person is talking about, and then I signed my signature, and I was originally Dave Livingston, and then I got married and I became Dave Smith, and now my signature is Dave Smith, I'm gonna need to do those forms that you mentioned.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, so before we move on to a new topic, we did get a question from a student about early voting, and I think you probably have answered it. Maybe sometimes the terminology is different in different places and in our discourse. So the question is basically a comment that the university's done a lot of advertising about voting, but has not. Maybe there's still a need to give a little bit more about how to vote early, I guess, is one part of it. And you could elaborate on that a little bit. You mentioned it quickly before, but early voting, and I think you've already covered the absentee part of early voting. But
for most people in Illinois, there's one of three options that you have to vote. You can either vote in person on Election Day at your local polling place, or you can vote early in person at a county office or a satellite voting location, or you can vote absentee by mail, which would be the mail-in ballot where you go request a mail-in ballot online, and then they will send it back to you. So for early voting in person, that's how I voted. I've already cast my ballot in this election. I just drove down after work one day to the county clerk's office, popped in and out in 10 minutes and voted. And you can do that now every weekday through the election at the Will County Clerk's office in Joliet, if you're a Will County voter. Starting on Monday, the county is going to be having many more satellite voting locations pop up all around the area throughout the county. I pulled off some of them that are near Lewis University. There's going to be a permanent voting location at the village of Romeoville, Lockport Township, the village of Plainfield, but they're throughout the county. And I'd encourage you to go to the Will County Clerk's website, and you can find out where the nearest one is for you to take care of it if you wanted to vote in person early.
That's great. And then I guess a whole other range of questions on my mind are about how do we best prepare for voting? So, where do we get information about candidates or other decisions that are made in the voting process? And do you have any recommendations about how to do it or where to get resources?
Yeah, there's a lot of good objective information about the candidates and the issues in any election that's out there. The trick is finding it and sorting through the stuff with a heavy bias or slant versus the more objective material. What I recommend, for one, the students in my campaigns and elections class, one of their assignments was to each create a nonpartisan voting guide. And one of the things I did was I took all the student assignments and I tried to compile them into basically a one-page document that showed, at least for the presidential race, where Donald Trump and Joe Biden stand on, about a dozen issues or so. But if you want to go beyond that, just beyond the presidency and down to, the Senate race, your local congressional races or state representative races or even county level offices, there's a few websites. I recommend ballotready.org as one. Ballotready.org is a nonpartisan website. Oh yeah, there it is on the screen. And what you can do when you show up there, there's that search bar in the middle. You can type in your address and it will, based on your address and location, populate your sample ballot. So it will pull off all of the districts that you live in, from voting for president down to, local dog catcher perhaps. And it will show the candidates that are running. It will link to those candidates' websites where applicable. It will give you a rundown of what interest groups may have endorsed each candidate, which sometimes gives you an insight into the type of candidacy they're running. And it'll often, break down stated policy positions as well. So I really like Ballot Ready. A similar resource is Vote 411, which is run by the League of Women Voters, another, excellent, objective, nonpartisan source. So that's where I personally go to find information about my local level candidates, because, let's face it, by now, most of us have formed an opinion on Donald Trump and Joe Biden. There's, if we believe the polls, there's very few undecided voters out there for presidency. But I challenge, just about anybody to try to name, the people running for their county commissioner seat, let alone their U.S. Congress or state Senate race.
The judges that get me.
Yeah, the judges. And so that's another good site that I could tell you about. The Illinois Bar Association does judicial evaluations of the judges running for retention in Illinois. So what the Illinois Bar Association does is that they send out evaluation surveys to lawyers that have argued before the different judges. So it's not a perfect measure by any means. You have to have some degree of trust in the surveys filled out by the lawyers, but they do rate the judges on matters such as their objectivity, their temperament, their qualifications, and perceptions of fairness, which I think are qualities that don't necessarily have much of a partisan streak to them. It's more, just evaluating the judges based on the people that interact with them at their place of employment.
And that's great, Steve. So we are starting to get some questions coming in. I know we had some kind of planned topical areas, but you just talked about the presidential election. So I'm going to go with, we had another question come in, but I'll get to that maybe later. So somebody wrote in and asked, under what circumstances would the presidential election end up in the Supreme Court? I mean, are there circumstances under which that would happen? And I know we can't do a whole class on civics here, but maybe I don't know if you could do it in a minute, but like, what's the short version to, here's how that ends up in front of the Supreme Court?
Well, let me give the civics answer. The way any case gets before the Supreme Court basically means that there's some sort of question that's being argued that involves the Constitution, the rights of citizens, and the powers of the federal government. And so, I can kind of game out scenarios in my head, but as long as a litigant can convince 4 of the Supreme Court justices to grant a writ of certiorari, a case will be heard before the Supreme Court. So, in what ways would that happen? We could have a replay of the 2000 Florida recount scenario where a state is engaging in a recount of the election, and it's argued that doing so is an infringement on constitutional rights. You could have a real constitutional crisis occur if a state legislature nominates a competing set of electors to the Electoral College. That would certainly, probably be a case that would go to the Supreme Court. You could have situations where the legitimacy of an election is questioned, whether, maybe there's a big electrical outage that causes people not to be able to vote, or maybe there is some sort of voter intimidation that occurs that prevents people from voting. And if that, leads to a question of an election's legitimacy, the courts can't overturn it. It wasn't that long ago, 2018. There was a congressional race in North Carolina where somebody working for one of the congressional candidates for U.S. Congress, this was a big race, right, was engaging in illegal ballot harvesting and fraudulently filling out absentee ballots and was caught. And the race was close enough where the true results of the election were truly in doubt, and they had to do a redo. I certainly hope, for the sake of American democracy and my sanity, that's not necessary, but those are the types of things that
you
could
raised a couple issues, Steve, that I guess the other question that has come in, as we're checking questions, is somewhat connected to a couple of the scenarios you said. It feels more normal, like, the power goes out across a whole state or something like that because of a storm. But this person asked, if I'm in line, basically, the night of polling, they're long polling lines, but the polls close before I get to vote. Do I quote unquote still get to vote if they close the polling center, but I'm in line?
Yeah, as long as you don't leave that line, you can't go home and have dinner and come back. But yes, absolutely. If you are in line when the polls close, you have every right to stay in that line and complete the voting process. That is absolutely 100% certain. I will say that aside from technological problems, Illinois has had a very strong record of not experiencing those long, tedious lines that we see sometimes in other states. I don't want to get into speculate necessarily why that is, but Illinois seems to have a much larger supply of poll workers and ballot stations and things like that. And, we don't see those 5-hour delays that you sometimes, see on the news. So I want to kind of tell your students that maybe haven't voted before that don't go into it expecting it to be a 4-hour process. Typically, when I vote, I'm in and out in, 15 minutes. Maybe you might have to wait 15 minutes or 20 minutes if you're coming after work and there's a big rush, but it's usually not a long, drawn out commit your whole day to an activity.
Yeah, thank you.
At least it
very
shouldn't
much.
be from a democracy perspective too.
Yeah.
And then kind of related in my mind, at least to that question, I know that you've done amazing work for years with our students around all the things that you've just been talking about in terms of voter education of our student community. And I know you work with the students directly, but I also know you don't do everything to ensure voting for the Lewis community. But we've had, I guess, some questions from students over the last week around making sure that there's time for them to vote during, it's a day when we have classes, we have people working and so on. So, if you have any advice about, for the community and for us, I guess, about, making it possible for people, and I think a lot of your answers have already addressed that. And then we have one specific question from a member of our faculty and staff community that is just sort of asking, like, how can people help? And the specific request was, do we have people to drive students, especially to, to take that, if they are going to vote in this region, that 1 mile trip down to Romeoville High School and so on?
Yeah, I can answer that second question first. There are plans in the works to utilize the student shuttle on election day to help bring students back and forth to the polling places. Okay. That's something that Lewis University is thankfully helped out with in the past, and I believe there's plans to continue that going forward. That's run and organized, I believe, out of partnership between student activities and the police department, which I think oversees the shuttle.
That makes sense.
I don't have a whole lot of information yet about the hours and the process for that. So maybe the message to take away from this is to keep checking your email, and
Yeah,
I'm sure we'll be able to communicate that out.
About these things.
And then the other question that you had about, how can we prepare to vote and make sure that everyone turns out on election day? One of the key takeaways that comes up again and again in the political psychology literature about motivating voter turnout is the importance of getting people to think about the act of voting in advance, and specifically telling them to get a plan in their head about how you vote. So sometimes, the experiments will be run where some people are called up and said, are you planning on voting, yes or no? And just that reminder alone will prompt people to vote the next day. But what's more effective is if people are asked to think of an election day plan. So it's not just, are you going to vote, but think about, when are you going to vote? Are you going to go before work? If that's the case, are you, how much earlier are you going to have to wake up and set your alarm? Do you have to arrange for childcare a little bit earlier? Do you have to set aside extra time for traffic? If you're going to go on your lunch break, does that mean that you're going to pack your lunch the night before to make sure that you don't have to get stuck at McDonald's the whole time? So getting people prepared and thinking about how they're going to vote is super influential in the process.
So on that front, I guess I'd like to combine two of these things, and I just thinking off the top of my head, so this was not planned, but as you talk about that, and it totally makes sense from a psychological point of view, you talked about the ability to vote early, and one of the locations was the Romeoville Town Hall, which is not 1 mile away, but about 2.2 miles away. There might be value in us considering running the shuttle maybe like one time a day, because what you, I think, said was the week before the election, people will be able to vote early at those locations, one of which is the village of Romeoville.
Starting on Monday.
And
not just a week, starting on Monday. Yeah.
We could potentially pick a time of day, I don't know, 4 in the afternoon, every day the week before the election, and send the shuttle over to Romeo Village Hall. And to your point about planning, I mean, we'd have to do some of this work, and maybe, we can work with Danielle on that. But to try to figure out a time where people could plan so they don't have to do it on Tuesday if it doesn't work in their schedule, because maybe their class schedule is just harder, class and work schedule on Tuesday, but maybe the week before they could vote. And because it's only a little further, an extra mile away from campus, they could get over there. So something for us to think about.
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Sounds important.
Yeah.
So maybe another thing I think that you and I have talked about, Steve, is that I believe it's the ballotready.org site has, you can look up the ballot that you're going for your location.
Yes.
And so for those of people who don't have an absentee ballot, it might be I assume it's connected to that psychology that you were talking about, where if you can kind of picture what you're going to be doing when you're there.
Yeah, and that gets to the intimidation factor too that new voters often have. It's almost like a form of test anxiety that probably the community is more familiar with. That when you're taking a test for the first time, especially with a new professor, you don't know what their tests look like. You don't know what types of questions they ask, and for some people that causes a lot of struggle and anxiety. So just knowing that in advance, this is what the ballot's going to look like. This is what races I'm going to be asked about. These are the referenda that are up in my area. It cuts down on so much of that, anxiety. And plus, just from, my perspective as a citizen, I like being able to research the candidates on my own rather than feeling rushed doing it, hunched over a table in the ballot booth.
Right.
So I can, spend some time, going on the campaign websites of the people running for county commissioner and getting a sense of which ones I think would best represent my viewpoints.
So, Steve, on that front, I keep, every time you talk, I mean, it's fascinating to talk to you. So, once again, thank you for being with us today. But when you raise that, it makes me think of those first-time voters, and that I love that notion of test anxiety, and it reminds me of kind of people taking the SAT or taking a kind of bubble test for the first time. So, the question I think some people might have is, I don't know enough about these, and I know you wouldn't recommend this, but I don't know enough about those other races. If I just want to vote for the president and my congressional person, will my ballot count if I don't fill out the whole ballot, if I don't vote for the dog catcher and the referendum on this and that? Or does if I just wanted to vote for the president, could I go in there, fill out one circle,
absolutely,
turn it in, and it still counts?
Or you could do the opposite too. You could vote for everybody but president if you wanted to. It's not uncommon. Every year when they print the final results, you'll see that there's a very uneven number of votes cast in each race. It's called ballot drop-off in political science. That the most commonly voted on race is going to be president, because that's attracts all the media attention. So let's say 99% of people, if not more than that, vote for president. But as you go through the ballot, down to those lower tiered races, there is drop off. So a lot of people aren't comfortable, voting to retain or not retain judges, for instance. And so people just leave it blank. And that's a perfectly acceptable, even responsible thing to do if you don't feel like you can make a reasonable decision. One thing I'll say is that those websites will help you research those lesser known candidates. So don't feel like you have to completely throw up your hands and assume that there's no way to understand any of this. That you can take some time and research the very local races, but certainly don't feel like you have to vote in each race. Alternatively, you might have some races where you just don't like any of the candidates, so leave them blank. That's fine.
So I think we've covered most of the practical goals we had for the day around voting, especially in relationship to our student population. And I would love to ask Steve a couple of more questions,
Please.
if it's okay.
Sure.
So I guess one question I have is, how is, in other countries where there is voting, how does voting differ across the world compared to the way it's done in the United States?
Oh boy, this could be a whole can of worms.
Okay, 1 minute or less.
Yeah, no. So, the whole question of registration, right? That varies. Some countries make you register, others don't. Others it's compulsory, right? In Illinois, for instance, we just started a system of automatic voter registration. Starting last year, anytime you go to a DMV or other government agency, you're going to be automatically registered to vote when you give your address, unless you opt out. Mm-hmm. And so that's a different option. Another option is whether or not voting is compulsory.
Right.
Voter turnout in the United States, tends to be much lower than some other nations. But when you start digging into the details, a lot of those other nations penalize you if you don't vote. I think in Australia, you have to pay like a $600 fine on your taxes if you don't vote. So of course, those nations have, voter turnout in the above 90%. So there's a wide variety of systems and processes out there, and all of them have their pros and cons, if you will.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, in the United States, you do have to register, usually in advance. Speaking of that, I don't know if I emphasized this earlier, that if you do miss that Sunday deadline to register to vote, you still can vote in Illinois in person. So I just want everyone to be aware of that if you wake up on election day, Tuesday, November 3rd, and you realize, oh no, I forgot to register to vote, you still can register to vote at a polling place. You'll just need to provide 2 forms of identification, one of which has your address on it. So you'll need a driver's license, state ID, utility bill, a checkbook, library card, student ID. Those types of identifications will all work. So.
Great. And then I just want to ask you a little bit about, could you, we'd like to ask this of all professors who are with us on Thursday afternoons, and so if you could just tell us a little bit about what your research is that you're working on right now, or any example of things that are on your mind in terms of your research.
Yeah, sure. I do a lot of scholarship relating to campaigns and elections, and a couple of years ago, I taught a special topics course in political science on political scandals. And so out of reading some of the material for that course, I came up with an idea for a research project that I've engaged in with a co-author, Dr. Mandy Bates-Bailey from Valdosta State University. And we ran a survey experiment on voter perceptions of candidates involved in political scandals. To give you the quick elevator speech real briefly, basically we divided up our respondents in this survey into 3 different groups, and we were trying to measure how they evaluate the candidates in this fictitious congressional race. So we gave them each a social media feed from a local newspaper that was made up, where the sample was able to read headlines and the beginning of a few news articles about the race. So 1/3 of the respondents got a bunch of basic run-of-the-mill election articles about a fictitious race. Another 1/3 of the sample got the same basic run-of-the-mill stories about the fake congressional race, but we added in that there were 3 or 4 stories about the candidate being accused of sexual harassment. And then a third final group of participants got the same stories as everybody else with the sexual harassment stories, but also a few other scandals sprinkled in there. Some campaign finance scandals, nepotism scandal, and so forth. And so what we were gauging is how do voter evaluations change of those candidates based on the level of exposure in these scandals. And what we're finding is that that candidates that are accused of one scandal suffer a large hit to their reputation and likability and willingness to vote for that candidate. But the addition of additional scandals after that doesn't have much of an effect. So, when it comes to evaluating candidates in a scandal, a candidate embroiled in scandal isn't necessarily punished by voters any more than a candidate facing just one scandal.
Ah, fascinating.
I'm going to stop myself there because otherwise I will keep going and going.
No, it's really
thank you.
fascinating.
All the numbers drop off on YouTube.
I guess one of the things that we want to, say as we wrap up is, again, one, how grateful we are for your leadership on campus in terms of coordinating, along with your students, much of the work to try to increase our voter turnout as a campus for both our employees but also for our students. So thank you for that. Thank you also for.
I also want to think that it's not just myself doing it. There's an entire committee of civic engagement that's a group of faculty, students, and staff that are motivated by these types of issues. So just because my name was on the email, I don't want to give the impression that I'm the only one working on it.
No, yeah, and we're grateful for that because I think all of us know that there's always many people around. So thanks for mentioning that. We're grateful for your presence here today and for all the information you've offered to us. Chris, I don't know if you have any closing comments that you want to make about either today or...
I do. Well, first of all, I want to announce or remind people that we do have a time scheduled for next Tuesday for Steve and 3 other faculty members who are going to join me for a teach-in on the election, and I think we have a graphic here featuring Steve, Dr. David Anderson, Dr. Jason Perry, and Dr. John Schneider, who will have a panel and go in more depth and range around the election. So I hope people will tune in for that, and we're sending out announcements about that. And then I'm resisting the inclination to be preachy about the election, but I hope especially our student viewers will engage in their civic responsibility to engage in our democracy. And I especially just want to say, whether you vote locally or in your home location, our students are members of our Romeoville community, and whether it be through voting or through other engagement, I hope that our students think of themselves as members of the local community and participate in a whole range of different ways on that front. And I'll just extend my thanks to Steve for helping out so much along with others, but also for being here with us today and providing such clear perspective on these things that are somewhat complex and overwhelming sometimes.
And thank you, Chris, and again, thank you, Steve. But I want to, I guess I'm going to double down on that and just say to all of you that are watching and may watch in the coming days, we talk about ourselves and pride ourselves on being a community which is really committed to being a sanctified zone. We are committed to being a place in which we take care of each other, that we are there for each other as a LaSallian community. And I guess what I want to say about that, when we talk about our values like justice, part of that is participating in the civic life of the place that we live, wherever we live. And so, I would ask you as well to just vote. Being a voter is participating in the democracy and being a part of your community. Doesn't matter how you vote. What matters is that you care enough to look at the issues, put them through the lens of your own values, and then vote to create the environment that you want for yourself and for others. Because we don't just vote for ourselves. We vote for our community, and we as a Lewis community of 7,000 people are impacted by the local environment of the politics that we live within. So, please, take advantage of all the information that Dr. Nawara shared with us today. Take advantage of your ability to vote in this democracy, and take care of yourselves and others around you by continuing to, be present to your fellow classmates, your colleagues, your teachers, by washing your hands, wearing your face coverings, keeping a good physical distance from each other, and have a wonderful week. We wish for you and your family many blessings.